She wore a simple dress, he wore a $5 million watch. The judge asked one question that cost him half his fortune. Mr. Vale, if Ms. Jameson was irrelevant to your enterprise, why is she the only non-executive listed in your private succession file? The question hung in the air like a suspended moment of truth. Atticus Vale, the man who had never lost a negotiation, a lawsuit, or even an argument, suddenly looked small beneath his immaculate suit and famous timepiece. His eyes darted to Lyra, sitting across the courtroom in her simple earth-tone dress. No designer label. No statement jewelry. Just a woman who had finally found her worth outside the shadow of his empire. The courtroom held its breath. Reporters leaned forward. The jury watched intently as the color drained from Atticus's face. Because he had forgotten. That private succession file, locked in his corporate vault, seen by only his most trusted advisors. Named Lyra Jameson as the sole person he trusted to manage his philanthropic legacy if anything happened to him. Not his executives. Not his board members. Not his family. The woman his legal team had just spent hours dismissing as irrelevant and inconsequential to his business affairs. Atticus began, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain. That document was drafted during a different period in our relationship. The judge leaned forward. A document you never amended after your separation. A document that remains legally binding today. A document that directly contradicts everything your counsel has argued in this courtroom. In that moment, the carefully constructed narrative of Atticus Vale, billionaire, visionary, man who controlled every variable, crumbled beneath the weight of his own forgotten truth. And Lyra, the woman who had once loved him, who had walked away with nothing but her dignity when she discovered how little he valued her, sat perfectly still. Not triumphant. Not vengeful. Simply present for the moment when his own actions finally caught up with him. This is the story of a man who measured everything by its price tag but failed to value what mattered most. Of a woman who chose peace over power. And of a courtroom reckoning that revealed how sometimes, the most expensive thing in life is the truth we try to hide, even from ourselves. Lyra Jameson grew up in a small rust-colored house near Lake Oswego, where mornings smelled like pine and evenings echoed with cricket songs. The house itself was nothing remarkable, weathered shingles, a slightly crooked porch, windows that stuck in humid weather, but it was filled with the kind of richness money can't buy. Her father, a high school music teacher, filled their home with melodies. Her mother, a nurse at the local hospital, filled it with compassion. Value isn't what something costs, her father would say, tuning his old guitar on Sunday evenings. Value is what something means. These weren't just words in the Jameson household, they were a way of life. When Lyra turned 16, her parents gave her a guitar that her father had carefully restored rather than a new one they couldn't afford. The instrument wasn't valuable by conventional standards, but the love embedded in its polished wood and carefully adjusted strings made it priceless to her. Music became Lyra's first language. Not in the showy, performance-driven way that leads to spotlights and record deals, but in the quiet, authentic manner that connects souls. She played at community gatherings, in nursing homes where elderly residents closed their eyes and remembered younger days, at small fundraisers for local causes. Her voice wasn't powerful, but it was true, clear and unaffected, like water from a mountain spring. After high school, Lyra surprised no one by declining the few college offers she received. "I'm going to learn by doing," she explained to concerned relatives. "University would just put me in debt for knowledge I can find in the world." That decision, made with the quiet confidence that characterized her approach to life, led to a patchwork career that perfectly suited her nature. She apprenticed with a local candlemaker, learning to blend scents and pour wax with the same attentive care she brought to her music. She taught guitar lessons to neighborhood children, charging only what families could afford. She helped coordinate community events, bringing people together around shared meals and simple celebrations. By 25, Lyra had established a small but sustainable life. Her handmade candles sold well at farmers' markets and in a few local shops. Her music brought joy to community gatherings. Her modest apartment above a bookstore provided everything she needed: space for her craft, proximity to nature, and quiet evenings for reading and reflection. "Aren't you ambitious for more?" a college friend asked during a rare visit, looking around Lyra's simple living space with barely concealed judgment. "More what?" Lyra replied with genuine curiosity. "More, everything. Money. Recognition. Security." Lyra considered this as she poured tea into mismatched cups. "I have enough money for my needs. My work brings me joy and serves others. And security." She smiled. "Well, that's mostly an illusion anyway, isn't it?" This philosophy, radical contentment in a world obsessed with more, wasn't something Lyra preached or promoted. It was simply how she lived, as naturally as breathing. She didn't judge those who sought wealth or status, she just didn't share their hunger. Her ambitions were different: deeper connections, more authentic expressions, greater harmony with the natural world. Her appearance reflected this same unaffected authenticity. She wore her chestnut hair in its natural waves, her clothes chosen for comfort and durability rather than fashion. Her only consistent adornment was a simple silver pendant, a small guitar pick her father had given her before his passing 3 years earlier. "To remind you that music lives in your hands," he had said, "not in any instrument." The loss of her father had been Lyra's deepest wound, one that even her natural resilience couldn't quickly heal. Music, which had always been her joy, became temporarily painful, each note an echo of his absence. For months, her guitar gathered dust in the corner of her apartment while she poured her grief into her candle-making, creating scents that evoked memories of him. Cedar and coffee, autumn leaves and old books. It was during this period of quiet mourning that Lyra developed what would later become her signature candle line, Memory Keepers, each scent designed to evoke emotional landscapes rather than simply perfume a room. These candles, with their complex, evocative fragrances and handwritten labels, began attracting attention beyond her local community. Small boutiques in Portland placed orders. A lifestyle blogger featured them in a holiday gift guide. A luxury hotel inquired about a custom line for their suites. This modest success didn't change Lyra's approach to life or business. She maintained her small-batch production methods, sourcing ingredients locally and sustainably. She continued teaching guitar lessons and volunteering at the community center. She declined offers that would have required mass production or compromising her materials' quality. "You could be making so much more," her mother observed during one of their weekly dinners, watching Lyra carefully package a special order. "I'm making enough," Lyra replied. "And I'm making it right." This quiet integrity, this refusal to separate values from value, defined Lyra's world before wealth entered it. She lived simply but richly, her days filled with meaningful work, genuine connections, and the peace that comes from wanting what you already have rather than having what you think you want. She had no way of knowing that this very quality, this authentic contentment in a world of hungry ambition, would soon attract the attention of a man who had everything except the ability to recognize what truly mattered. A man whose world operated according to entirely different principles. A man whose presence in her life would challenge everything she believed about worth, value, and the true cost of compromise. That man was Atticus Vale, and his entrance into Lyra's carefully balanced world would be like a meteor striking still water, creating ripples that would eventually become waves powerful enough to change both their lives forever. The collision course was set on an unseasonably warm spring evening, at a charity fundraiser for children's music education. A cause close to Lyra's heart since her father's passing. She had been invited to perform not because of her professional status, but because the organizer had heard her playing at a community garden event and been moved to tears by the authenticity of her music. Just 2 songs, the organizer had requested. Something that reminds people why music matters. Lyra had accepted without hesitation, unaware that this simple performance would alter the trajectory of her life. Unaware that among the wealthy donors and social climbers would be a man whose empire was built on calculation but whose heart remained unexpectedly vulnerable to the one thing money couldn't buy, genuine emotion expressed without agenda or artifice. As she tuned her father's guitar in a quiet corner of the venue, preparing to share her music with strangers who measured value in dollars rather than meaning, Lyra remained blissfully ignorant of how completely her world was about to change. How the very qualities that made her different from the power brokers and influencers in attendance, her sincerity, her contentment, her allergic reaction to pretense, would soon make her irresistible to the one man who had everything except authenticity. While Lyra Jameson was growing up in a home filled with music and modest means, Atticus Vale was being forged in an environment where value was measured exclusively in achievement, influence, and financial dominance. Born to a hedge fund manager father and a mother who treated social status as a competitive sport, Atticus learned early that worth was something to be proven rather than inherent. The Vale household operated with the precision and emotional temperature of a Swiss bank. Dinner conversations revolved around market movements and strategic advantages. Birthday gifts were often stocks or investment opportunities rather than toys or experiences. Praise was reserved for exceptional performance, never for mere effort or character. "The world doesn't reward good intentions," his father would say, reviewing Atticus's report card with a critical eye even when it showed straight A's. "It rewards results. Remember that." This lesson, that outcomes mattered more than process, that winning was the only acceptable result, became the foundation of Atticus's worldview. He excelled academically not from love of learning but from fear of failure. He pursued leadership positions in school organizations not from desire to serve but from understanding that power was currency. He cultivated relationships strategically, always with an eye toward future advantage. By 16, Atticus had already developed the calculating precision that would later define his business approach. When classmates were learning to drive, he was learning to analyze market trends. When peers were attending parties, he was creating algorithms to predict consumer behavior. His first business, a primitive but effective online textbook exchange, netted him 6 figures before graduation, a success he leveraged into admission to an elite university despite grades that had slipped during his entrepreneurial efforts. "Grades are for people who need validation," he told his concerned mother. "I prefer validation that comes with decimal points." At university, Atticus refined both his business acumen and his understanding of human dynamics. He studied economics and psychology, less interested in degrees than in applicable knowledge. He built connections with professors who had industry ties, with wealthy classmates who had family networks, with anyone who might later prove useful to his ambitions. Not through charm, Atticus was never particularly charming, but through demonstrated value and strategic positioning. His first major venture launched during his junior year, a financial technology platform that made complex investment strategies accessible to middle-class users. The timing was perfect, catching the first wave of app-based financial services before the market became saturated. By 23, Atticus had his first million. By 25, his first 100 million. By 30, he had built Vale Enterprises into a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate with interests spanning technology, real estate, media, and emerging markets. The speed and scale of his success became legendary in business circles. Profiles in financial publications described his ruthless efficiency and uncanny ability to identify undervalued opportunities. What these glowing accounts often missed was the human cost of his rise. The relationships sacrificed, the ethical corners occasionally cut, the emotional development stunted by single-minded focus on empire building. Atticus's personal life reflected the same calculated approach that characterized his business dealings. He lived in a penthouse designed by a famous architect, not because he appreciated the aesthetics, but because it projected the right image. He dated beautiful, accomplished women. Not from genuine connection, but because they complemented his public persona. He attended cultural events and supported charitable causes, not from passion for the arts or compassion for the less fortunate, but because such activities were expected of someone in his position. The one genuine indulgence in his otherwise strategic existence was his watch collection, specifically, the custom Vacheron Constantine that became his signature piece. Valued at approximately $5 million due to its rare complications and historical significance, the timepiece represented more than just wealth or status to Atticus. It symbolized his conquest of time itself, his ability to bend even this most uncontrollable element to his will through sheer force of productivity and ambition. Most people are ruled by time, he once told a business reporter who commented on the watch. I prefer to rule it. This philosophy, control above all else, governed every aspect of Atticus's existence. His daily schedule was planned in 15-minute increments. His diet and exercise regimen was optimized for maximum cognitive performance. His personal relationships were managed with the same efficiency as his business partnerships, maintained when valuable, discarded when not, always with clear boundaries and expectations. What this approach produced was extraordinary success by conventional metrics. By 35, Atticus Vale had amassed more wealth than most people could spend in multiple lifetimes. His business insights were sought by governments and global corporations. His investment decisions could shift entire market sectors. His name had become synonymous with a particular brand of calculated brilliance, cold but undeniably effective. What this approach failed to produce was anything resembling emotional fulfillment or genuine human connection. The same strategic thinking that made Atticus exceptional at building wealth made him remarkably poor at building relationships. He had associates rather than friends, arrangements rather than partnerships, achievements rather than memories. This emotional poverty remained largely unacknowledged, even to himself. On the rare occasions when a sense of emptiness penetrated his carefully constructed defenses, Atticus treated it as a temporary inefficiency to be optimized away. Perhaps through a new acquisition, a different relationship, a more impressive achievement. The possibility that his entire approach to life might be fundamentally flawed never seriously occurred to him. Until, that is, a spring evening at a charity fundraiser when the final note of a song performed by a woman in a simple dress with no agenda beyond the music itself somehow bypassed all his defenses and reached something in him that had been dormant for so long he had forgotten its existence. That moment, when Atticus Vale first heard Lyra Jameson sing, would later be identified by both of them as the beginning of everything that followed, the connection, the conflict, and ultimately the courtroom confrontation that would force both to confront truths they had spent years avoiding. But on that evening, as Atticus stood perfectly still among moving bodies, his $5 million watch suddenly feeling strangely heavy on his wrist, all he knew was that something had shifted in his carefully ordered world. Something had slipped past his calculations and strategic thinking. Something had reached the human being beneath the billionaire facade. And for the first time in his adult life, Atticus Vale found himself responding to a situation without a strategy, a plan, or a clear understanding of the potential return on investment. He simply needed to meet the woman whose voice had somehow found its way through armor he hadn't even realized he was wearing. The Harmony Foundation's annual fundraiser transformed the Portland Art Museum into a showcase of wealth and influence. Under crystal chandeliers, the city's elite mingled over champagne and carefully crafted hors d'oeuvres, their conversations a practiced dance of social positioning and strategic networking. Donations were promised, connections leveraged, appearances maintained, all in service of children's music education, at least nominally. Atticus Vale moved through this environment with practiced ease. He had attended countless such events, mastered the art of meaningful small talk, perfected the balance between approachability and authority that kept people simultaneously comfortable and slightly intimidated. His presence at the fundraiser was primarily strategic. The Harmony Foundation had connections to educational technology initiatives that aligned with Vale Enterprises' expansion plans. Atticus. "Wonderful to see you," called Eleanor Harrington, the foundation's director, approaching with the eager deference people typically showed him. "Your support means everything to our programs." "The foundation's work aligns with our educational initiatives," Atticus replied with practiced warmth. "Data shows early music education correlates strongly with later academic success. It was a response he had given variations of at dozens of similar events. Acknowledging the cause while framing his support in terms of measurable outcomes rather than emotional connection. Eleanor nodded appreciatively, accustomed to translating the language of business into the language of philanthropy. "We have a special program tonight," she mentioned as they moved toward the main gallery where the evening's entertainment would take place. "A local musician who embodies exactly what our programs hope to achieve, authentic expression through music." Atticus made an appropriate noise of interest, his attention already shifting to a potential business contact he'd spotted across the room. Eleanor's description sounded like the usual fundraiser entertainment, competent but forgettable performances designed to create emotional connection to the cause without disrupting the real business of the evening, networking and donation solicitation. The first performer was exactly as Atticus had expected. A talented young violinist from the Foundation's program, technically impressive but performing with the self-conscious precision of someone who had been extensively coached. The audience applauded appreciatively. Checkbooks metaphorically loosening as they witnessed the program's success embodied in the child's performance. When Eleanor announced the next performer, a local artist whose music reminds us why we do this work, Atticus checked his watch discreetly. The $5 million Vacheron Constantine on his wrist indicated he had another 40 minutes before he could reasonably exit to his next engagement. He settled back in his chair, preparing to endure what he assumed would be another well-intentioned but ultimately forgettable performance. Lyra Jameson walked onto the small stage without introduction or fanfare. No elaborate outfit, no dramatic entrance, just a woman in a simple dress carrying a well-worn guitar. She settled onto the stool, adjusted the microphone slightly, and looked out at the audience with a calm directness that somehow cut through the practiced social masks of the room. "This first song is called Ordinary Light," she said simply. "It's about finding beauty in everyday moments." Her fingers moved across the guitar strings with natural grace, creating a melody that seemed to grow organically rather than being performed. When she began to sing, her voice carried the same quality, clear, unaffected, as authentic as conversation but shaped by subtle artistry that transformed simple words into something unexpectedly moving. The song itself was deceptively straightforward, observations of morning light through windows, the sound of rain on a roof, the feeling of soil between fingers while gardening. But something in Lyra's delivery, in the genuine reverence she brought to these ordinary experiences, created an atmosphere of unexpected intimacy in the formal gallery space. Atticus found himself strangely unable to engage in his usual mental multitasking. Typically during such performances, he would be reviewing meeting notes or planning his next conversation while maintaining the appearance of attention. But Lyra's music somehow demanded presence in a way he wasn't accustomed to giving. As she finished the first song and moved seamlessly into a second, this one about her father's hands teaching her to play guitar, Atticus realized he was experiencing something unusual. He was simply listening. Not analyzing, not strategizing, not calculating potential value or return. Just receiving what was being offered with an openness he hadn't allowed himself in years. The final note of her second song seemed to hang in the air for a moment before dissolving into silence. There was a beat of collective held breath before the applause began, not the polite, measured response of people fulfilling social obligation, but something more genuine. People exchanging glances, dabbing at eyes, experiencing the rare vulnerability of being moved in a setting where emotional guards were typically maintained at all costs. Atticus didn't immediately join the applause. He sat perfectly still, aware of an unfamiliar sensation in his chest, a kind of opening or expansion that was both uncomfortable and compelling. When he finally did bring his hands together, the motion felt strangely inadequate as a response to what had just occurred. As Lyra thanked the audience and left the stage, the room quickly returned to its previous state, conversations resumed, networking continued, the business of the evening proceeded. But Atticus remained momentarily apart from this familiar dance, his usual sharp focus slightly blurred by the lingering effect of the music. "Remarkable, isn't she?" Eleanor appeared at his side, clearly pleased by the impact of the performance she had arranged. Yes, Atticus agreed, the simplicity of his response unusual for a man who typically spoke in carefully constructed paragraphs. Who is she? Lyra Jameson. Local artist, makes the most extraordinary candles as well. Her father was a music teacher before he passed, one of the inspirations for our program, actually. Atticus nodded, filing away this information while scanning the room. Is she still here? I believe she's near the West Gallery. She doesn't usually stay long at these events, not really her natural environment. Eleanor smiled knowingly. Would you like an introduction? Please, Atticus replied, surprising himself with the immediacy of his response. As Eleanor led him through the crowd, Atticus experienced an unfamiliar sensation, uncertainty. He, who entered every interaction with clear objectives and exit strategies, suddenly had no specific agenda beyond wanting to speak with the woman whose music had momentarily dismantled his carefully constructed defenses. They found Lyra in a quiet corner of the West Gallery, carefully packing her guitar while chatting with one of the event's staff. Up close, she was neither conventionally beautiful nor particularly striking. Medium height, chestnut hair falling in natural waves, features that would be described as pleasant rather than stunning. Yet something in her presence commanded attention, a quality of being fully present and completely herself that stood out in a room where most people were performing carefully calibrated versions of themselves. Lyra, dear, Eleanor called. There's someone who would like to meet you. Atticus Vale, one of our most generous supporters. Lyra looked up, her expression open and direct. No flash of recognition at his name, no shift in demeanor upon realizing his status. Just a simple, genuine smile as she extended her hand. Hello. Thank you for supporting the Foundation's work. It makes a real difference in children's lives. Her handshake was firm and brief, her eye contact steady. No deference, no flirtation, no calculation, just one human being acknowledging another. Your performance was extraordinary, Atticus said, surprised by the sincerity in his own voice. You have a remarkable gift for authenticity. That's kind of you to say, Lyra replied. Though I don't think of authenticity as a gift so much as a choice we all can make. The comment, delivered without pretension or judgment, nevertheless carried a subtle challenge to the carefully constructed persona Atticus presented to the world. In any other context, from any other person, he might have found it presumptuous. Instead, he found himself genuinely curious about the worldview that would produce such a perspective. Eleanor, sensing the unexpected connection forming, discreetly excused herself, leaving them in a momentary bubble of privacy amid the crowded event. Do you perform professionally? Atticus asked, genuinely uncertain of her status given the quality of her music but the simplicity of her presentation. Not in the traditional sense, Lyra explained. I play at community events, teach lessons, share music where it feels meaningful. My primary work is actually making candles. Candles, Atticus repeated, the word feeling incongruously small next to the impact of her music. Memory keepers, she elaborated. Scents designed to evoke emotional landscapes. Similar to what I try to do with music, just through a different sense. The concept intrigued him. Not as a business opportunity, which would have been his usual filter, but as a genuine expression of creativity he hadn't encountered before. That sounds. He searched for the right word, authentic. Lyra smiled, a warm expression that reached her eyes. It is. At least, I try to keep it that way. Small batch, local materials, personal attention to each creation. Their conversation continued with surprising ease, moving from her work to the Foundation's programs to broader questions about the role of arts in education. Throughout, Atticus found himself engaged in a way that felt unfamiliar, not strategic, not performative, just genuinely present in the exchange of ideas and perspectives. When Lyra mentioned needing to leave, she had an early morning market to prepare for. Atticus experienced an unexpected reluctance to end the conversation. I'd be interested in seeing your candle-making process sometime, he said, the invitation emerging without his usual careful calculation of purpose and outcome. And perhaps hearing more of your music. Lyra considered him for a moment, her gaze direct and evaluating in a way few people dared with Atticus Vale. I have a small studio above Riverbank Books on Hawthorne. You're welcome to visit Thursday afternoon if you're genuinely interested. I'll be preparing for the weekend market. The qualification, if you're genuinely interested, struck Atticus with its straightforward honesty. She wasn't angling for his attention or resources. She wasn't impressed by his status or wealth. She was simply offering access to her world on the condition of authentic interest rather than curiosity or strategic advantage. Thursday afternoon, he confirmed, already mentally rearranging meetings and commitments. I look forward to it. As they exchanged contact information. Lyra writing her number on a simple business card that listed only her name and memory keepers, Atticus handing her his private card rather than his standard business one, both recognized that something unexpected had occurred. Not romance, not exactly friendship, but a genuine connection that had somehow bypassed the usual social filters and strategic positioning. What neither could have anticipated was how this simple, authentic exchange would eventually lead them through love and loss to a courtroom where the true value of authenticity would be measured against the cold calculations of empire and ego. How the collision of their fundamentally different approaches to life would ultimately force both to confront truths about themselves they had spent years avoiding. As Lyra left the gallery with her guitar case slung over her shoulder, and Atticus returned to the networking portion of his evening with slightly less focus than usual, the first threads of their intertwined fate had already begun to weave together, creating a pattern neither could yet discern but which would eventually transform both their lives in ways no strategy could anticipate and no wealth could control. Thursday afternoon found Atticus Vale doing something entirely out of character. He was walking up a narrow staircase above an independent bookstore, without an assistant, security detail, or clear business objective. His $5 million watch and tailored suit looked almost comically out of place in the bohemian neighborhood, drawing curious glances from passing pedestrians. The door at the top of the stairs bore a simple wooden sign, Memory Keeper's Studio. Atticus hesitated briefly before knocking. A rare moment of uncertainty for a man accustomed to owning every room he entered. Something about crossing this threshold felt significant in ways he couldn't quite articulate. Lyra opened the door with hands slightly stained with dye and a warm, genuine smile. "You came," she said, sounding pleasantly surprised. "Come in." The studio was nothing like the sleek, minimalist spaces Atticus typically occupied. Sunlight streamed through large windows, illuminating a room filled with organized creative chaos. One area held candle-making equipment, wax melters, fragrance oils in small bottles, containers of dried flowers and herbs. Another corner housed musical instruments, her guitar, a small keyboard, a handmade drum. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books, finished candles, and small collections of natural objects, interesting stones, dried seed pods, feathers. "This is where everything happens," Lyra explained, gesturing to the space. "Work, music, sometimes life in general. It's..." Atticus searched for an appropriate word, alive. Lyra laughed, a genuine, unguarded sound. "That's a perfect description, actually. I've always thought spaces should feel lived in, not just looked at." This philosophy stood in stark contrast to Atticus's multiple properties, each professionally designed and maintained in a state of perfect, sterile order. His homes were showcases rather than sanctuaries, statements rather than expressions. "I was just finishing a batch of summer solstice candles," Lyra continued, moving toward her work table. "You're welcome to watch, or explore the studio if you prefer." Atticus chose to watch, finding himself unexpectedly fascinated by the process. Lyra worked with focused attention but also evident joy, explaining each step. How different waxes created different textures, how essential oils combined to evoke specific emotional responses, how the containers themselves were made by a local potter who used clay from the nearby river. "Each candle is unique," she explained, carefully pouring wax into a ceramic vessel. "Even in the same scent line, no two are identical. That's important to me, that each creation has its own character. That approach limits scalability, Atticus observed, his business mind automatically assessing the operation. It does, Lyra agreed without defensiveness. But scalability isn't my goal. Connection is. Each candle goes to someone who will use it in their home, their personal space. That relationship matters more to me than volume. The statement challenged Atticus's fundamental business philosophy, where growth and expansion were unquestioned virtues. Yet he found himself considering her perspective with unexpected openness. As the afternoon progressed, their conversation flowed with surprising ease. Lyra asked thoughtful questions about his work, not the usual inquiries about wealth or power, but genuine curiosity about what drove him, what problems he was trying to solve, what satisfaction he found in his achievements. Atticus found himself sharing thoughts he rarely articulated, even to himself. "The challenge is what compels me," he admitted as they sat near the window, drinking tea from mismatched mugs. "Seeing patterns others miss, building systems that work more efficiently, proving that the impossible is actually just the improbable with the right approach." "And when you achieve these impossible things?" Lyra asked. "What then?" The question gave him pause. "Then, there's the next challenge." "Always forward, never present," she observed without judgment. "That sounds exhausting." No one in Atticus's world would have dared make such a comment. People agreed with him, flattered him, occasionally challenged specific strategies but never his fundamental approach to life. Yet Lyra's observation carried no criticism, just genuine curiosity about a way of being so different from her own. "It can be," he acknowledged, surprising himself with the admission. "But it's what I know." Before leaving, Atticus purchased several candles. Not as a courtesy, but because he was genuinely intrigued by the concept of scents designed to evoke emotional states. Lyra wrapped them carefully, explaining each one's inspiration and intention. "This one reminds me of your music," he said, indicating a candle labeled "Quiet Reverence," with notes of cedar, rain, and something indefinable. Lyra smiled, pleased by the connection. "That's one of my favorites. Inspired by early mornings by the lake where I grew up." As Atticus prepared to leave, he found himself reluctant to return to his scheduled world of meetings and strategic decisions. "Would you have dinner with me tomorrow?" he asked, the invitation emerging without his usual calculation of purpose and advantage. Lyra considered him thoughtfully. "I would. But somewhere simple, please. I'd feel out of place at the kind of restaurant I imagine you typically frequent." The request, honest, unpretentious, gently boundary-setting, was unlike the responses Atticus usually received to his invitations, which ranged from eager acceptance to strategic negotiation. Lyra wasn't impressed by his wealth or status, she simply wanted an environment where genuine connection remained possible. "You choose the place," he said, another uncharacteristic surrender of control. Their first dinner took place at a small farm-to-table restaurant in a converted Victorian house. Casual by Atticus's standards but still thoughtfully chosen by Lyra to bridge their different worlds. The evening unfolded with the same unexpected ease as their studio conversation, ranging from childhood memories to philosophical questions about purpose and value. "What do you consider successful?" Lyra asked as they shared a simple dessert of local berries and cream. "Building something lasting," Atticus replied after consideration. "Creating systems and structures that continue functioning effectively even without my direct involvement." "So success is about permanence for you," she observed. "Creating something that outlasts you. Isn't that universal?" he asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. "I don't think so," Lyra said, her expression thoughtful. "For me, success is about presence, being fully engaged in whatever moment I'm experiencing, whether that leaves a permanent mark or not. Like music. It exists in time, then disappears, but that doesn't diminish its value." The concept challenged Atticus's fundamental metrics for evaluating worth and achievement. Yet instead of dismissing it as impractical idealism, he found himself considering how different his life might be if measured by presence rather than permanence, by quality of experience rather than quantity of impact. This first dinner led to others, each conversation deepening their connection while highlighting their differences. Atticus introduced Lyra to his world in carefully measured doses, a private gallery showing, a rooftop concert, a weekend at his coastal property. Lyra shared her world with equal intentionality, community music gatherings, farmers' markets where she sold her candles, quiet evenings of conversation with her small circle of close friends. What began as curiosity gradually evolved into genuine affection. Atticus found himself drawn to Lyra's authentic presence, her ability to find joy in simple experiences, her unwavering commitment to her values. She brought warmth to corners of his life that had been efficiently organized but emotionally barren. For her part, Lyra discovered unexpected depth beneath Atticus's strategic exterior. His mind fascinated her. The way he could see connections and possibilities others missed, his genuine desire to solve complex problems, the flashes of vulnerability that occasionally emerged when his carefully constructed persona momentarily relaxed. Their developing relationship confused and intrigued their respective circles. Lyra's friends worried about the power imbalance, the fundamental difference in values, the potential for heartbreak when worlds so different inevitably collided. Atticus's associates viewed his interest in this ordinary woman with confusion or strategic speculation, assuming she must possess some exceptional quality or advantage not immediately apparent. "What exactly do you see in her?" his CFO asked bluntly after meeting Lyra at a corporate event where she had attended as Atticus's guest, wearing a simple dress among designer gowns, making no effort to impress or network with the powerful figures in attendance. Atticus considered the question more seriously than his colleague probably intended. "Authenticity," he finally replied. "She's exactly who she appears to be. Do you know how rare that is in our world?" This quality, being genuinely present rather than strategically positioned, continued to draw Atticus deeper into Lyra's orbit. For the first time in his adult life, he found himself making decisions that prioritized relationship over advantage, connection over control. He rearranged meetings to attend her small performances. He spent weekends helping at community events that offered no business benefit. He listened to her perspectives on wealth and value with growing openness rather than dismissive tolerance. 6 months into their relationship, Atticus surprised both himself and Lyra by suggesting they move in together. "Not to my penthouse," he clarified, recognizing how uncomfortable she would be in that sterile, showcase environment. "Somewhere new. A place that could be ours rather than mine." The suggestion revealed how deeply Lyra had influenced his thinking. Atticus Vale, who had never compromised on living arrangements or considered another person's comfort above his own preferences, was offering to create a shared space that honored both their needs. After careful consideration, Lyra agreed. They found a converted warehouse loft near the river, spacious enough for Atticus's requirements but warm and characterful enough for Lyra's sensibilities. The process of combining their lives in this shared space highlighted both their growing connection and their fundamental differences. Atticus approached furnishing their home with his usual efficiency, researching optimal layouts, consulting designers, considering functionality and aesthetic impact. Lyra brought a more intuitive approach, finding pieces with history and character, creating spaces that invited creativity and conversation, ensuring their home felt lived in rather than displayed. The resulting space reflected their evolving relationship, neither fully surrendering to the other's vision, but both finding unexpected value in the compromise. Atticus discovered that Lyra's handmade candles and collected objects brought warmth to spaces his designer would have left minimalist and impersonal. Lyra appreciated the thoughtful systems Atticus implemented. The perfectly positioned lighting, the efficient kitchen layout, the technology that simplified rather than complicated daily life. For nearly a year, they existed in a delicate balance, two fundamentally different approaches to life finding unexpected harmony. Atticus softened in Lyra's presence, occasionally setting aside his relentless focus on achievement to simply experience a moment without analyzing its value or strategic advantage. Lyra expanded her horizons through Atticus's influence, finding ways to share her gifts more widely without compromising their authenticity. Their friends and associates gradually accepted the unlikely pairing, some even recognizing the complementary nature of their differences. Lyra brought humanity to Atticus's efficiency, he brought structure to her organic approach. She reminded him of values beyond balance sheets, he helped her create sustainable foundations for her creative work. Yet beneath this apparent harmony, subtle tensions were developing, fault lines that would eventually fracture their carefully constructed balance. The most significant emerged around Atticus's inability to fully integrate Lyra into certain aspects of his life, particularly his business empire and long-term planning. The first serious conflict arose when Atticus established a charitable foundation focused on arts education, a cause inspired by Lyra's passion for accessible music programs. While he consulted her on program design and implementation, he structured the foundation's governance to maintain his complete control, offering Lyra a position that was influential in appearance but advisory in reality. "I don't understand why I wouldn't be a full voting board member," Lyra said when reviewing the organizational documents. "This work directly aligns with my experience and values." "The foundation is connected to Vale Enterprises," Atticus explained with the patient tone he used when clarifying business realities to those he considered less strategically minded. "Its governance needs to maintain appropriate corporate alignment." "You mean you need to control it," Lyra translated, her directness cutting through his careful phrasing. "I mean I'm responsible for it," he countered. "Legally and financially." This exchange revealed a fundamental disconnect in their understanding of partnership. For Lyra, shared passion meant shared authority. For Atticus, ultimate control remained non-negotiable regardless of emotional connection or shared values. Similar tensions emerged in other areas. When Lyra's candle business gained attention from a major retailer interested in carrying her memory keepers line, Atticus immediately began strategizing expansion plans. Production scaling, distribution logistics, brand protection. Lyra's resistance to rapid growth and mass production frustrated him, his assumption that bigger automatically meant better frustrated her. "Not everything needs to be an empire," she told him during one particularly heated discussion. "Some things are valuable precisely because they remain small and personal." "But your work deserves wider recognition," he argued, genuinely believing his approach would benefit her. "These scents you've created, the emotional landscapes they evoke, more people should experience them." "At what cost, though?" Lyra challenged. "Mass production would mean standardization. Different materials. Losing the personal connection to each creation. That matters to me more than scale." These conflicts revealed the persistent gap between their value systems, Atticus measuring worth primarily through growth, reach, and control. Lyra prioritizing authenticity, connection, and integrity of process. Neither was wrong in their perspective, but the differences created recurring friction that became increasingly difficult to navigate. The most significant warning sign appeared during a conversation about their future together. When Lyra casually mentioned the possibility of marriage someday, Atticus's immediate response was to discuss prenuptial agreements and asset protection rather than emotional commitment. "That's your first thought?" Lyra asked, hurt evident in her voice. "Legal structures to keep your wealth separate from our relationship?" "It's just practical reality," Atticus replied, genuinely confused by her reaction. "Anyone in my position has to consider these things. It doesn't reflect how I feel about you." "But it does reflect how you think about us," Lyra observed quietly. "As something that needs to be managed and controlled rather than simply experienced and trusted." This exchange revealed the fundamental challenge their relationship faced, Atticus's inability to separate value from control, to trust and emotional connection without strategic protection. Despite genuine love for Lyra, he couldn't fully surrender the calculating approach that had defined his success and shaped his understanding of security. For her part, Lyra struggled to reconcile the Atticus who could listen to her music with genuine openness, who could engage with her friends without condescension, who could occasionally set aside his strategic thinking to simply be present, with the Atticus who instinctively structured every significant aspect of their shared life to maintain his ultimate control. These tensions might have eventually found resolution through continued growth and compromise. Both were intelligent, self-aware individuals capable of adaptation and genuine care for each other. Their differences, while significant, were not inherently irreconcilable given sufficient commitment to understanding and respecting each other's core needs. But the delicate balance they had established was about to face its greatest test, one that would reveal the true depth of Atticus's ability to value connection over control, and Lyra's capacity to compromise authenticity for security. A test that would ultimately lead them from shared domesticity to courtroom confrontation, from lovers navigating differences to adversaries facing fundamental truths neither had fully acknowledged. The catalyst for this transformation lay in a document Atticus had quietly filed without Lyra's knowledge, a legal designation that revealed more about his true priorities than any words of affection or acts of compromise ever could. A document that, once discovered, would force both to confront the question at the heart of their relationship: can love truly flourish when one person's need for control fundamentally undermines the other's need for authentic recognition? The answer would eventually come not in private conversation or relationship counseling, but in a public courtroom where the woman in a simple dress and the man with the $5 million watch would face each other across an unbridgeable divide of their own creation. The discovery happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Lyra was searching for insurance documents in Atticus's home office, a space she rarely entered out of respect for his privacy and work boundaries. A pipe had burst in her studio, damaging some of her equipment and finished inventory. Since they lived together and shared certain expenses, she needed the policy information to file a claim. Atticus was traveling, attending a technology conference in Singapore. Before leaving, he had told her the insurance documents were in the left drawer of his desk. Everything you need should be in the blue folder, he'd explained during their brief video call that morning. If you have any questions, just text me. The blue folder contained various insurance policies, home, auto, valuable items, but nothing covering her studio space or business equipment. Lyra continued searching, opening other folders in the same drawer, hoping to find the relevant documents. In a red folder labeled Personal Legal, she discovered something unexpected, a document titled Domestic Partnership Designation. Curious, she began reading, assuming it might be related to their shared living arrangement and household expenses. What she found instead was a carefully crafted legal declaration that classified her as a temporary domestic partner, with explicitly limited rights regarding Atticus's assets, business interests, and estate. The document, filed with his corporate legal team 6 months earlier, included specific language preventing her from claiming any ownership interest in Vale Enterprises or associated entities, regardless of contribution, duration of relationship, or verbal assurances. Most painfully, it included a clause designating her role in their shared home as contingent occupancy at the discretion of the primary owner, effectively defining her as a guest rather than a partner in the space they had supposedly created together. The document had been executed without her knowledge or signature, a unilateral declaration of terms rather than a mutual agreement. The date on the filing revealed it had been prepared shortly after their conversation about potential marriage, as if Atticus had been prompted by that discussion to establish legal protections against the very commitment they had been considering. Lyra sat at his desk, the document trembling slightly in her hands, as the full implications became clear. While building what she believed was a partnership based on mutual respect and shared values, Atticus had been quietly constructing legal barriers to ensure his empire remained entirely separate from their relationship. While speaking of their future together, he had been establishing structures to limit that future's impact on his assets and control. Most revealing was not the financial protections themselves. Lyra had never been interested in Atticus's wealth, but the secretive, unilateral nature of the filing. He hadn't discussed these concerns with her, hadn't suggested a mutual agreement that respected both their interests. He had simply imposed his terms, assuming either that she would never discover them or that she would accept them as another example of his practical reality. When Atticus returned from Singapore 3 days later, he found their shared loft unusually quiet. No music playing, no candles burning with Lyra's signature scents, no evidence of her creative presence that typically transformed the space from architectural showcase to actual home. Lyra, he called, setting down his briefcase. She emerged from the bedroom, her expression composed but distant in a way he had never seen before. We need to talk. The document lay on the coffee table between them as Lyra explained how she had discovered it while searching for insurance information. Her voice remained steady, but the hurt beneath her calm exterior was evident in her carefully chosen words and the unusual stillness of her typically expressive hands. I don't understand why you would file this without discussing it with me, she said after explaining what she had found. Or why you would define our relationship in such limited, contingent terms while telling me you saw a future together. Atticus's response revealed the fundamental disconnect that had been growing beneath their apparent harmony. It's just standard protection, he explained, his tone suggesting this should be obvious. Anyone in my position would have similar arrangements. It doesn't reflect how I feel about you. That's exactly the problem, Lyra replied quietly. You don't see how your actions and your feelings contradict each other. You say you value our relationship, but you secretly file documents that define me as temporary and contingent. You talk about our home, but legally establish it as exclusively yours where I'm merely permitted to stay. You're overreacting, Atticus said, shifting to the slightly condescending tone he used when explaining business realities to those he considered less strategically minded. This is just practical protection of assets I built before we met. It's not personal. Not personal. Lyra repeated, the first edge of anger entering her voice. You made unilateral decisions about the legal status of our relationship without my knowledge or input. How is that not personal? It's business, Atticus insisted. My corporate counsel advised these protections given my position and assets. It has nothing to do with us. This distinction, between business decisions and personal relationship, revealed the compartmentalization that allowed Atticus to believe his actions were reasonable. In his mind, protecting his empire was entirely separate from loving Lyra. The possibility that these parallel tracks might fundamentally contradict each other simply didn't register in his strategic thinking. There is no separation between business and personal when you make secret decisions that directly affect our relationship, Lyra said, her voice quiet but firm. You can't claim to value partnership while unilaterally imposing terms that define me as temporary and contingent. The conversation continued for hours, circling the same fundamental disconnect. Atticus genuinely couldn't understand why legal protections he considered standard and necessary had created such profound hurt. Lyra couldn't accept that someone who truly valued her as a partner would make such significant decisions without her knowledge or input. What would you have me do? Atticus finally asked, frustration evident in his voice. Leave billions in assets unprotected? That's not reasonable. I would have you treat me as a partner worthy of honest conversation, Lyra replied. I've never wanted your money, Atticus. I've wanted your trust. Your respect. Your willingness to build something together rather than simply fitting me into structures you control. As night fell over their loft, the distance between them seemed to grow despite their physical proximity. Two people who had shared a bed, a home, and seemingly a future now faced the reality that their fundamental understanding of partnership might be irreconcilably different. I need some time, Lyra said finally. I can't stay here tonight. Where will you go? Atticus asked, genuine concern mixing with his frustration. To Myra's, she replied, referring to her closest friend. I need space to think clearly about what this means for us. As she packed an overnight bag, Atticus watched with the growing realization that this conflict was different from their previous disagreements. The careful balance they had maintained between his need for control and her need for authenticity had finally tipped beyond recovery. Lyra, he said as she prepared to leave. I love you. That hasn't changed. She paused at the door, her expression sad rather than angry. I believe you do, in the way you understand love. But your version includes secret legal protections and unilateral decisions. Mine requires transparency and mutual respect. I'm not sure those can coexist. The week that followed brought multiple attempts at reconciliation. Atticus offered to modify the legal designation, to include Lyra in his estate planning, to establish a trust in her name, all solutions that addressed financial concerns rather than the fundamental breach of trust his actions had created. "You still don't understand," Lyra told him during their final conversation. "This isn't about money or legal status. It's about how you made significant decisions about our relationship without including me in the process. It's about the fact that you don't truly see me as an equal partner deserving of honesty and consultation." "That's not fair," Atticus protested. "I've included you in my life more than anyone else. I've adjusted my schedule for your performances, supported your business decisions even when I disagreed with them, created a home that reflects your values alongside mine." "All true," Lyra acknowledged. "And yet when it came to defining our legal relationship, you made that decision alone and in secret. That reveals something fundamental about how you view partnership." 10 days after discovering the document, Lyra returned to the loft while Atticus was at work. She packed her personal belongings, clothing, books, the few pieces of furniture she had brought to their shared home. She left her key on the counter alongside a letter explaining her decision. "I'm not leaving because I stopped loving you," she wrote. "I'm leaving because I finally understand that your need for control will always take precedence over genuine partnership. You've built an extraordinary empire, Atticus, but empires require subjects, not equals. I can't be the former, and you don't truly want the latter, despite what you may believe about yourself." When Atticus returned that evening to find half their home empty and Lyra's letter on the counter, his first reaction was disbelief followed quickly by strategic planning. This was a problem to solve, an outcome to optimize, a situation to manage back to acceptable parameters. He immediately began crafting approaches to bring Lyra back. Financial incentives, relationship compromises, strategic concessions. What he failed to recognize, even in this moment of loss, was that his instinctive response revealed exactly what Lyra had identified as their fundamental incompatibility. He was approaching her departure as a business challenge rather than an emotional reality, a situation to control rather than a consequence to understand and accept. Atticus made multiple attempts to contact Lyra in the weeks that followed. He sent carefully worded messages, arranged deliveries of meaningful gifts, even appeared at her friend Myra's apartment where she was temporarily staying. Each attempt reflected his inability to truly hear what Lyra had been trying to tell him, that the issue wasn't what he could offer or provide, but how he fundamentally viewed their relationship. "Please just give her space," Myra finally told him when he appeared at her door for the third time. "She's not playing a game or negotiating terms. She's processing a fundamental breach of trust." "I need to explain," Atticus insisted. "She misunderstood the purpose of the legal designation." Myra studied him with the direct gaze that reminded him uncomfortably of Lyra. "Did she misunderstand that you filed it without telling her? That you made unilateral decisions about the legal status of your relationship? Those are facts, not interpretations." This perspective, that the issue was his secretive process rather than the document's content, gradually began to penetrate Atticus's strategic thinking. Yet even this realization didn't fundamentally shift his approach. He still believed the situation could be managed back to equilibrium with the right combination of concessions and commitments. What he failed to understand was that Lyra wasn't seeking better terms. She was acknowledging a fundamental incompatibility in how they viewed partnership, trust, and mutual respect. No offer or adjustment could bridge that gap without genuine transformation in Atticus's understanding of relationship itself. A transformation his entire life experience and success had taught him was unnecessary. A month after Lyra's departure, she found a small apartment above a pottery studio in a quiet neighborhood far from the sleek urban district where she had lived with Atticus. She reclaimed her independence with quiet determination. Rebuilding her candle business, reconnecting with the community she had somewhat neglected during her relationship, finding her way back to the music that had always been her emotional center. The process wasn't easy. Despite the clarity of her decision, Lyra grieved the relationship deeply. She had genuinely loved Atticus, not his wealth or status, but the man beneath the strategic exterior. The moments when his defenses lowered and genuine connection emerged. The potential she had seen in him to integrate heart and mind rather than compartmentalizing them. "I keep thinking about who he could have been," she confided to Mira during a quiet evening of tea and conversation. "If he could have just trusted enough to be vulnerable, to share control, to see partnership as strength rather than risk." "Some people can't," Mira replied gently. "Their entire identity is built around control and calculation. Surrendering that, even for love, feels like self-destruction." This insight helped Lyra gradually accept that her departure hadn't been a failure, but a necessary recognition of reality. She hadn't been able to change Atticus's fundamental approach to relationship because that approach was inextricably linked to the identity and success he had spent a lifetime constructing. For his part, Atticus processed the end of their relationship in characteristically strategic fashion. He analyzed what had gone wrong, identified the variables he had failed to properly manage, and filed the experience under lessons learned, while redirecting his focus to business expansion and new acquisitions. At least, that was the approach he presented publicly. Privately, in moments of rare honesty with himself, he acknowledged a loss that couldn't be quantified on balance sheets or compensated through achievement. The loft that had briefly felt like a home returned to being merely an impressive property. The spaces Lyra had filled with music and warmth remained conspicuously empty despite his efforts to redesign and repurpose them. 3 months after their separation, Atticus made one final attempt at reconciliation. Not through intermediaries or strategic gestures, but through direct, personal contact. He appeared at the farmer's market where Lyra sold her candles, approaching her booth during a quiet moment between customers. "Lyra," he said simply. "May I speak with you?" She looked up, surprise briefly crossing her features before her expression settled into calm composure. "Atticus. I didn't expect to see you here." "I know," he acknowledged. "I should have called first. But I wanted to speak with you directly, without preparation or strategy." This admission, that he was approaching her without his usual calculated planning, represented a small but significant shift. Lyra recognized the effort it required for someone so controlled to act spontaneously, especially in a setting so far from his usual environment. "I can take a short break," she conceded, asking the vendor in the neighboring booth to watch her table. They walked to a quiet corner of the market, an awkward distance between them despite having once shared every aspect of daily life. Atticus had clearly made an effort to dress more casually than his usual business attire, though his watch, the $5 million Vacheron Constantine that had become his signature piece, remained on his wrist, a persistent symbol of the wealth and status that defined his identity. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began, uncharacteristically hesitant. "About making decisions unilaterally. About not treating you as an equal partner." Lyra waited, neither encouraging or discouraging his continued reflection. "I want you to know that I've revised all the legal designations," he continued. "Removed the language you found objectionable. Established proper recognition of your status and rights." The offer revealed both his genuine desire to address her concerns and his persistent misunderstanding of their fundamental nature. Even now, he was approaching reconciliation as a negotiation, offering improved terms rather than transformed understanding. "Thank you for doing that," Lyra said gently. "But the issue was never the specific legal language. It was the fact that you made those decisions without me, then kept them secret. It revealed how you fundamentally view relationship, as something to manage rather than something to share." "I'm trying to understand that perspective," Atticus said, frustration edging his voice. "But from my position, protecting assets and establishing clear legal parameters is just responsible management. It doesn't reflect emotional commitment." "That's exactly the disconnect," Lyra explained. "You believe you can separate legal and financial decisions from our relationship. I believe those decisions are inherently part of how you view us as partners. Neither of us is wrong in our perspective, but the difference may be irreconcilable." This conversation, more honest than their final arguments had been, clarified the fundamental incompatibility that had ultimately ended their relationship. Not a failure of love or commitment, but a difference in basic understanding of what partnership meant and required. "I miss you," Atticus said finally, the simple statement more genuine than his previous strategic approaches. "I miss you too," Lyra acknowledged. "But I don't miss feeling like a managed asset rather than a trusted partner. I don't miss discovering decisions about our relationship that were made without my knowledge or input." They parted without resolution, both recognizing that genuine reconciliation would require changes neither was capable of making. Atticus surrendering the control that defined his identity and success, or Lyra accepting a relationship where transparency and equal partnership remained conditional rather than fundamental. In the months that followed, both rebuilt their lives along separate paths. Lyra expanded her candle business, developing new scent lines and teaching workshops on natural fragrance creation. She returned to performing music at community events, her voice finding new depth through the emotional journey she had experienced. She created a small but meaningful life centered around authenticity, creativity, and genuine connection. Atticus redoubled his focus on business expansion, acquiring new companies and developing innovative technologies. He dated occasionally, beautiful, accomplished women who understood the rules of engagement with someone of his wealth and status. He maintained the external appearance of someone for whom personal setbacks were merely temporary distractions from continued success and achievement. Their paths might never have crossed again had circumstances not intervened in the form of a shareholder lawsuit that would ultimately force both to confront truths they had been avoiding since their separation. A legal challenge that would transform their private relationship history into public record, their personal values into courtroom evidence, and their fundamental differences into the basis for a judgment that would reshape both their lives in ways neither could have anticipated. The catalyst for this transformation lay in a document Atticus had forgotten existed. Not the domestic partnership designation that had ended their relationship, but something far more revealing about his true feelings and values. A document that would ultimately answer the question neither had fully resolved during their time together: did Atticus Vale truly value Lyra Jameson, or was she simply another asset to be managed within his carefully controlled empire? The answer would come not through private reflection or emotional reconciliation, but through a judge's unexpected question in a public courtroom where the woman in a simple dress and the man with the $5 million watch would face each other across an unbridgeable divide of their own creation. 3 years passed. For Lyra, they were years of quiet rebuilding and unexpected growth. After leaving Atticus, she had initially focused simply on stability. Finding affordable housing, re-establishing her business, reconnecting with the community she had somewhat neglected during their relationship. But as months turned into years, her life expanded in ways she hadn't anticipated. Her candle business, Memory Keepers, evolved from a small farmer's market operation into a respected artisanal brand. She maintained her commitment to small batch production and authentic materials, but found ways to reach a wider audience through carefully selected boutiques and a thoughtfully designed website. She hired 2 part-time assistants, both artists with complementary skills, creating a small, collaborative workshop rather than a traditional business hierarchy. Most significantly, Lyra expanded her work to include wellness workshops that combined scent creation, music, and mindfulness practices. These gatherings, held in community centers, yoga studios, and occasionally private homes, allowed her to share her integrated approach to creativity and emotional well-being. Not empire building as Atticus would have defined it, but meaningful growth aligned with her values and purpose. "You've created something beautiful here," observed Eleanor Harrington, the Harmony Foundation director who had first introduced her to Atticus, after attending one of Lyra's workshops. "Something authentic that actually helps people." "That was always the goal," Lyra replied. "Connection and meaning, not scale for its own sake." Her personal life found similar balance. The apartment above the pottery studio became a true home, filled with books, music, handmade objects, and the quiet evidence of a life lived intentionally. She dated occasionally, approaching relationships with greater clarity about her needs and boundaries. She cultivated friendships based on mutual support and shared values rather than convenience or strategic advantage. The pain of her relationship with Atticus gradually transformed from active hurt to integrated experience, not forgotten, but absorbed into her understanding of herself and her capacity for both love and self-protection. She no longer checked business news for mentions of him or drove alternate routes to avoid passing buildings bearing his name. The emotional entanglement had resolved into something more like distant recognition, acknowledgement of a significant chapter that had closed definitively. For Atticus, the 3 years following Lyra's departure unfolded along a more complex trajectory than his public persona suggested. Outwardly, he maintained the appearance of uninterrupted success and strategic focus. Vale Enterprises expanded into new markets, acquired promising startups, and increased its valuation by billions. He appeared on magazine covers, spoke at global economic forums, and continued building the empire that defined his identity and purpose. Privately, however, Atticus experienced subtle but significant shifts in his perspective and priorities. The loft he had shared with Lyra, the space that had briefly felt like a home rather than a property, was sold within months of her departure, replaced by a new penthouse that bore no memories of their shared life. He traveled more frequently, spent longer hours at the office, filled his schedule with the constant motion that prevented reflection or emotional processing. Yet despite these efforts at strategic avoidance, certain changes persisted. He found himself less satisfied by purely transactional relationships, more aware of the emotional emptiness beneath his professional achievements. The women he dated, selected for compatibility with his lifestyle and image, increasingly felt like interchangeable components in a life designed for appearance rather than fulfillment. Most significantly, Atticus began questioning aspects of his business approach that he had previously accepted without examination. The relentless focus on growth and control that had defined his success suddenly seemed less obviously beneficial when viewed through the lens of what it had cost him personally. "You've seemed distracted lately," observed his CFO during a strategy meeting, after Atticus questioned whether a particularly aggressive acquisition aligned with their stated company values. "Just considering long-term implications beyond immediate financial returns," Atticus replied, the response revealing a perspective that would have been foreign to him before Lyra. These subtle shifts remained largely private, contained within the carefully managed compartments of Atticus's life. He never spoke of Lyra, never acknowledged the impact of their relationship or its ending, never suggested to anyone that the experience had affected his fundamental approach to success and value. The strategic facade remained intact, the empire continued expanding, the appearance of complete control persisted. Until the lawsuit. It began as a relatively standard shareholder action. Claims that Vale Enterprises had misrepresented certain assets in its annual report, potentially inflating valuation and stock prices. Such challenges were not uncommon for companies of Vale's size and profile, typically resolved through legal maneuvering and financial settlements without significant public impact. What transformed this particular lawsuit from routine corporate defense to personal reckoning was the discovery process. As part of their case preparation, the plaintiff's attorneys requested extensive documentation regarding Vale Enterprises' governance, decision-making processes, and asset management. Among the thousands of documents produced in response to this request was the domestic partnership designation that had ended Atticus's relationship with Lyra. In isolation, this document might have remained unremarkable, a standard legal protection common among high-net-worth individuals. But the attorneys also discovered references to Lyra's unpaid work for the Vale Foundation, the charitable organization Atticus had established with her input but structured to maintain his complete control. These references suggested significant contributions to foundation programs and initiatives for which she had received neither compensation nor formal recognition. The combination of these discoveries, the restrictive partnership designation alongside evidence of uncompensated professional contributions, created a potentially damaging narrative, that Atticus Vale had deliberately minimized Lyra's role while benefiting from her work and expertise. This narrative, while tangential to the main shareholder claims, offered the plaintiff's attorneys a compelling angle for questioning Atticus's overall business ethics and transparency. When Atticus learned that Lyra's name had emerged in the discovery process, his immediate response was characteristic: strategic damage control. His legal team contacted her with a settlement offer, financial compensation for her foundation contributions in exchange for a non-disclosure agreement regarding their personal and professional relationship. The offer arrived at Lyra's workshop on a Tuesday afternoon, delivered by a courier in a sleek black suit who seemed conspicuously out of place among the candlemaking equipment and natural materials. The envelope bore the Vale Enterprises logo in embossed silver, a visual reminder of the world she had left behind 3 years earlier. Inside was a carefully worded letter from Atticus's chief legal counsel, explaining the situation in deliberately vague terms and proposing a mutually beneficial resolution to potential misunderstandings regarding past professional contributions. Attached was a draft agreement offering substantial financial compensation in exchange for confidentiality and a release of all potential claims. Lyra read the documents twice, her initial surprise giving way to a complex mixture of emotions. Disappointment that Atticus's first contact after 3 years would come through lawyers rather than directly, frustration at the implication that her contributions could be retroactively valued and settled through financial transaction, and a quiet sadness at the confirmation that he remained unchanged in his fundamental approach to relationship and responsibility. After careful consideration, she declined the offer with a brief, direct response. I cannot agree to confidentiality regarding matters of public record and personal experience. While I have no desire to participate in litigation against Vale Enterprises, I will not accept payment for silence about my own history and contributions. This response, neither vengeful nor accommodating, reflected Lyra's continued commitment to authenticity over advantage. She wasn't seeking financial gain or public attention, but neither would she participate in concealing truth to protect Atticus's carefully constructed narrative. When her declination reached Atticus, his reaction revealed how little he had evolved despite his private questioning. His immediate response was to increase the settlement offer, assuming her resistance was a negotiating tactic rather than a principled position. When this approach failed, he attempted to leverage mutual connections to persuade her, still viewing the situation as a problem to be managed rather than a consequence to be accepted. She's not negotiating, Mira told him bluntly when he contacted her as one of the few people who had maintained connections to both of them. She's stating a boundary. There's a difference. This lawsuit has nothing to do with her, Atticus argued. She's being drawn into a corporate matter that could become unnecessarily public and uncomfortable. Maybe the discomfort is necessary, Mira suggested. Maybe it's time for the truth about her contributions to be acknowledged rather than managed away. This perspective, that transparency might be valuable rather than threatening, remained foreign to Atticus's strategic thinking. His entire approach to business and personal matters was built around controlling narratives, managing outcomes, and minimizing unpredictable variables. The possibility that allowing truth to emerge unmanaged might ultimately serve a greater purpose than containment simply didn't align with his fundamental worldview. As settlement negotiations failed and the lawsuit proceeded toward trial, Atticus's legal team made one final attempt to resolve the Lyra situation. They requested a private meeting, not mediated through lawyers but direct conversation between the former partners who had not spoken in 3 years. Lyra agreed to this meeting with careful boundaries, a neutral location, limited time frame, specific agenda focused on the legal matters at hand rather than personal reconciliation. The setting she chose was telling: a small community garden where she volunteered, a place aligned with her values and completely removed from Atticus's world of corporate boardrooms and luxury restaurants. When Atticus arrived at the garden on a clear spring morning, the contrast between them could not have been more striking. He wore a tailored casual suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, the $5 million watch gleaming on his wrist despite the informal setting. Lyra wore simple linen pants and a hand-dyed top, her only adornment the silver guitar pick pendant that had been her father's gift. "Thank you for meeting with me," Atticus said as they sat on a wooden bench surrounded by early spring blooms. "I appreciate your willingness to discuss this directly." Lyra nodded, her expression composed but reserved. "I've always preferred direct conversation to intermediaries." The subtle reminder of how he had approached their breakup, through legal designations rather than honest discussion, wasn't lost on Atticus. He shifted slightly, the bench's simple wooden construction a far cry from the ergonomic seating he was accustomed to in his corporate environment. The shareholder lawsuit is becoming complicated, he began, defaulting to the business-focused approach that felt most comfortable. Your name has emerged in discovery, specifically regarding work you did for the foundation while we were together. I'm aware, Lyra replied. Your legal team made that clear in their settlement offer. Which you declined, Atticus noted, a hint of his old frustration emerging. I'm trying to understand why. The compensation offered was more than fair for the consulting work you provided. Lyra studied him for a moment, seeing both the familiar strategic thinker she had once loved and the fundamental disconnect that had ultimately separated them. This isn't about compensation, Atticus. It's about truth. I contributed significantly to programs that you publicly claimed credit for. I developed approaches that are still being used by the foundation. I'm not seeking payment for that work. I offered it freely at the time. But I won't pretend it didn't happen or that my contributions were insignificant. No one is suggesting your contributions weren't valuable, Atticus countered, his tone shifting to the slightly condescending one he used when explaining business realities to those he considered less strategically minded. The settlement simply creates a clean resolution that benefits everyone involved. It benefits you, Lyra corrected gently. It allows you to maintain the narrative that everything associated with Vale Enterprises is exclusively your creation and under your control. That's not truth, it's image management. This perspective, prioritizing truth over strategic advantage, remained fundamentally foreign to Atticus despite his private questioning of his business approach. The possibility that transparency might be more valuable than control simply didn't align with the principles that had built his empire and defined his success. What exactly do you want from this situation? He asked finally, genuine confusion mixing with his frustration. Nothing, Lyra replied simply. I'm not seeking anything from you or Vale Enterprises. I'm simply declining to participate in concealing my own history and contributions. If the court or the public learns about my role in the Foundation's programs, that's simply truth emerging rather than being managed away. The conversation continued in this vein, Atticus offering increasingly generous settlement terms, Lyra consistently declining on principle rather than financial consideration. The fundamental disconnect that had ended their relationship remained unchanged. His need to control narratives and outcomes versus her commitment to authenticity regardless of consequence. As their meeting concluded without resolution, Atticus made one final attempt. This could become very public, Lyra. Details about our relationship, the legal designations, everything. Is that really what you want? The question revealed his persistent belief that public exposure would be inherently threatening to both of them. That privacy and control were obviously preferable to transparency and vulnerability. It was the perspective of someone who had spent a lifetime managing his image and protecting his carefully constructed narrative. I'm not afraid of the truth, Atticus, Lyra replied quietly. I never have been. That's always been the difference between us. With those words, she effectively ended both the meeting and any possibility of resolving the situation through private settlement. The matter would proceed through legal channels, potentially transforming their personal history into public record and courtroom evidence. As Lyra watched Atticus walk away from the garden, his tall figure incongruous among the flowering plants and simple pathways, she felt a complex mixture of emotions. Sadness for what might have been had he been capable of genuine partnership, compassion for the man whose need for control had ultimately isolated him from authentic connection, and a quiet certainty that maintaining her integrity mattered more than avoiding discomfort or conflict. For his part, Atticus returned to his waiting car with mounting frustration and genuine bewilderment. His entire life experience had taught him that every situation could be managed with the right combination of resources and strategy. Lyra's refusal to accept what he considered a generous resolution defied his fundamental understanding of rational behavior and self-interest. What neither fully appreciated in that moment was how their private conflict was about to become public spectacle. How the values and perspectives that had separated them as partners would soon be evaluated in a courtroom where the woman in a simple dress and the man with the $5 million watch would face each other across an unbridgeable divide of their own creation. The court date was set for 3 weeks later. As preparation for trial intensified, both Lyra and Atticus received formal subpoenas to testify regarding her contributions to the Vale Foundation and the nature of their professional relationship during their time together. For Lyra, this development brought neither satisfaction nor anxiety. She prepared thoughtfully, gathering records of her work, organizing documentation of programs she had developed, reviewing the timeline of her involvement with the foundation. Her approach remained consistent with her overall values: honest, straightforward, focused on factual accuracy rather than strategic advantage. For Atticus, the subpoenas triggered full strategic mobilization. His legal team developed careful messaging to minimize Lyra's contributions while avoiding outright dismissal that might appear disrespectful. They prepared him for potential questions about the domestic partnership designation, framing it as standard asset protection rather than deliberate devaluation of their relationship. They analyzed every possible angle and outcome, developing contingency plans for various scenarios that might emerge during testimony. As the trial date approached, media interest intensified. The business press, initially focused on the technical aspects of the shareholder claims, increasingly highlighted the human interest angle, the relationship between the billionaire CEO and the artisanal candlemaker whose work had apparently been incorporated into his foundation without formal recognition or compensation. Vale's ex-partner to testify about uncompensated work. Billionaire's former girlfriend claims credit for foundation programs. Vale Enterprises faces questions about relationship and recognition. These headlines, while oversimplifying the situation, captured the essential narrative that was emerging: a stark contrast between power and authenticity, between strategic control and principled transparency. A contrast that would become visually manifest when Lyra and Atticus finally faced each other in the courtroom after 3 years of silence. The morning of the trial, Lyra woke early in her apartment above the pottery studio. She prepared with characteristic thoughtfulness, not for public impression but for her own sense of purpose and groundedness. She practiced meditation, played her guitar briefly, and selected her clothing with care: a simple dress in soft earth tones, comfortable but dignified, chosen for its authenticity rather than strategic impact. As she pinned her father's silver guitar pick pendant to the dress, Lyra reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. Not with anxiety or resentment, but with a clear-eyed acceptance of how her commitment to authenticity had both connected her to Atticus and ultimately separated them. How the values she had maintained throughout their relationship, honesty, transparency, genuine partnership, had become the very principles at stake in the courtroom where they would soon face each other. "I'm not here for revenge," she told her reflection in the mirror. "I'm here for truth." With that clarity of purpose, she left her apartment and headed toward a confrontation that would ultimately transform both their lives in ways neither could have anticipated when they first met at a charity fundraiser 4 years earlier. When a billionaire with a $5 million watch first heard a woman in a simple dress sing with an authenticity that momentarily penetrated his strategic defenses and touched something in him he had forgotten existed. The shareholder lawsuit against Vale Enterprises had begun as a relatively standard corporate action: claims of misrepresented assets and inflated valuations affecting stock prices and investor returns. Such challenges were common in the business world, typically resolved through legal maneuvering and financial settlements without significant personal impact on the executives involved. What transformed this particular case from routine corporate defense to personal reckoning was the unexpected emergence of Lyra Jameson's name during the discovery process. As attorneys reviewed thousands of internal documents, they found repeated references to programs she had developed for the Vale Foundation. Initiatives that Atticus had publicly presented as his own vision and direction. More significantly, they discovered emails and meeting minutes revealing that these programs, focused on arts education and community wellness, had become central to the foundation's public image and fundraising success. The very work that had been incorporated without formal recognition or compensation had ultimately generated millions in donations and significant positive publicity for Vale Enterprises. When combined with the domestic partnership designation that had classified Lyra as temporary and contingent, while she was actively contributing to the foundation's success, these discoveries created a compelling narrative of exploitation and misrepresentation. A narrative that the plaintiff's attorneys quickly recognized could support their broader claims about Vale Enterprises' business ethics and transparency. The treatment of Ms. Jameson's contributions appears to follow a pattern of misrepresentation that extends beyond personal relationship into business practices, argued the lead plaintiff's attorney in a pretrial motion. The court should consider this evidence relevant to establishing a consistent approach to attribution and valuation throughout Vale Enterprises' operations. Atticus's legal team fought vigorously to exclude this evidence, arguing that personal relationship matters were irrelevant to the shareholder claims. But Judge Rebecca Harmon, known for her no-nonsense approach to corporate cases, ruled that the professional aspects of Lyra's contributions to the Vale Foundation were indeed relevant to the broader questions of corporate governance and transparency. While the court will not entertain purely personal matters, Judge Harmon stated in her ruling, the professional contributions of Ms. Jameson to Vale Foundation programs and their subsequent representation to donors and the public fall within the scope of this case's central questions regarding accurate attribution and valuation. This ruling effectively ensured that both Lyra and Atticus would need to testify about their professional relationship and her contributions to the foundation. Testimony that would inevitably touch on the personal dynamics that had shaped their collaboration and its ultimate dissolution. As media interest intensified, Atticus made one final attempt at private resolution. His legal team approached Lyra with a significantly enhanced settlement offer, not just financial compensation for her past contributions, but a formal acknowledgement of her role in developing key foundation programs and a commitment to properly attribute her work going forward. This offer, more aligned with her actual concerns than previous proposals focused solely on financial settlement, revealed that Atticus had finally begun to understand what mattered to her. Yet it came with the same fundamental condition, confidentiality regarding their personal relationship and the domestic partnership designation that had ended it. After careful consideration, Lyra declined this offer as well, her response reflecting the same principled position she had maintained throughout. I appreciate the acknowledgement of my professional contributions, but I cannot agree to conceal the context in which those contributions were made and subsequently appropriated. Truth cannot be selectively disclosed. With this final rejection of settlement, the stage was set for public testimony that would transform their private history into courtroom evidence and media narrative. The scheduled trial date, 3 weeks after their meeting in the community garden, approached with increasing public attention and speculation. Business publications analyzed the potential impact on Vale Enterprises' stock value and corporate governance. Entertainment media explored the relationship angle, often with sensationalized framing that reduced complex dynamics to simplistic characterizations. Social commentators noted the symbolic significance of the case. A stark contrast between corporate power and individual principle, between strategic control and authentic transparency. For Lyra, this growing public attention brought unwelcome disruption to her carefully constructed life. Reporters appeared at her workshop and community classes. Customers and students asked increasingly personal questions about her relationship with Atticus. Her website received so much traffic from curious visitors that it temporarily crashed, affecting her small business operations. Despite these challenges, she maintained her characteristic composure and focus. She continued teaching her scheduled workshops, fulfilling orders for her candles, and preparing thoughtfully for her upcoming testimony. When friends expressed concern about the public exposure, she responded with quiet confidence, "Truth doesn't harm me. It's secrecy and misrepresentation that cause damage." For Atticus, the approaching trial triggered full strategic mobilization. His public relations team developed careful messaging that acknowledged Lyra's contributions, while emphasizing the foundation's collaborative approach and his own visionary leadership. His legal counsel prepared exhaustive briefing materials addressing every possible question about their relationship and her work. His executive team developed contingency plans for various market reactions to potential testimony and outcomes. Yet beneath this characteristic strategic response, Atticus experienced something less familiar, genuine uncertainty. For perhaps the first time in his business career, he faced a situation he couldn't fully control through resources or strategy. Lyra's principled refusal to participate in managed narrative challenged his fundamental approach to problem-solving and risk management. This uncertainty manifested in uncharacteristic behaviors noticed by those closest to him. His normally precise schedule became erratic. His decision-making, typically swift and confident, showed occasional hesitation. His legendary focus wavered in meetings, his attention drifting to the window or his watch, the $5 million timepiece that had once symbolized his mastery of time itself now marking the approach of a confrontation he couldn't optimize or control. "Are you concerned about the testimony?" his CFO asked carefully during a strategy session, after Atticus had missed a key point for the third time. "Not concerned," Atticus replied with forced confidence. "Just ensuring we're properly prepared for all contingencies." But the truth, which he acknowledged only in rare moments of private honesty, was more complex. He was indeed concerned, not primarily about financial consequences or corporate governance implications, but about facing Lyra across a courtroom after 3 years of silence. About having their relationship examined in public after he had so carefully compartmentalized it in private. About confronting the possibility that his strategic approach to life and relationship might be judged and found wanting by standards he had spent a lifetime dismissing as impractical idealism. As the trial date approached, both Lyra and Atticus received formal preparation from the respective legal teams. Lyra met with the plaintiff's attorneys, reviewing the documents they had discovered and clarifying her role in developing foundation programs. Atticus worked intensively with his defense team, practicing responses to potential questions and refining messaging about collaborative credit and institutional development.